Good morning and welcome. It is our great honor to welcome to our community Michael Eisenberg, who will become our teacher and share his unique synthesis of what I would call Torah, Umada, Uma'aseh. And I'll explain that in a second. Today is co-sponsored by Shaarei Tefillah, by our Yedidim, our dear friends at Beit Sasson, the Sephardic Synagogue of Newton, and also the Adam Street Synagogue. And we welcome members of each of those synagogues who are present here today. Michael and I attended many of the same yeshivot and educational institutions. We overlapped a bit and shared a friendly acquaintance that has renewed itself over the years from time to time. But the hallmark of the institutions which we studied was Torah, Umada, Torah, and I'll not translate it as science, but wisdom in the original sense of scientia, of broad learning. But Michael attaches to that wonderful pairing, ma'aseh, action, living in the world, making a contribution, building up the good society. And that, if I would summarize the point of the Tree of Life and Prosperity, is that in life we learn well, we do well, we aspire to be successful and to make contributions. And then finally, we want to do good. We really want to improve our world and make sure that our learning, our religion, and our contributions are for a force of good. And we're so honored to have you, Michael, who embodies these three aspects and bring them together. The formal introduction is going to be delivered by our wonderful member and friend and teacher, Mattia Schechter. Mattia is the person we thank for bringing Michael to our synagogue. And Mattia, I'm going to ask you to come and introduce Michael. Thank you.
It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Michael Eisenberg. When describing Michael to others, I have a hard time deciding if he is a phenomenal Torah scholar who just happens to be an incredibly successful investor. This way, Michael is widely regarded as one of the most foremost venture capitalists in Israel and has been included several times on Forbes' Midas list for the best venture investors in the world. He began his career at Israel Seed Fund from 1997 to 2005 before becoming a general partner at Benchmark Capital, a storied Silicon Valley firm. In 2013, he co-founded Aleph to invest in the Israeli startup ecosystem, helping Israel grow from Startup Nation, a book which many of you have read, to become Scale-Up Nation, a term I believe Michael might have coined. Michael's notable investments include Answers.com, Shopping.com, Wix, Gigya, and WeWork, and more recently, Lemonade, now offering car insurance, Healthy.io, Melio, Fabric, Nexar, and many more. Michael has published 7 books in Hebrew and has adapted and republished 2 of them in English. His book, The Vanishing Jew, transformed the way I view Megillat Esther, and I've been thoroughly enjoying his recent book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity, sharing his Divrei Torah with my family at our Shabbat table. He's a contributor to Times of Israel, Medium.com, The Marker, and Calculus, discussing public policy in Israel and other issues of national and international importance. Michael is also a Baal Tzedakah, with 2 examples being his involvement with Israeli agriculture organization HaShomer HaChadash, and as the founder of Nova Network, an organization that uplifts Olim working in high tech. He serves on the board of Yeshivat Har Etzion. I suspect we have several alums or parents of alums in the crowd today, where he studied in the past. Michael and his wife Yafa live in Jerusalem. He is the proud father of 8, father-in-law of 3, and grandfather of 3. I'm fortunate to call him a friend and role model. Without further ado, Michael Eisenberg.
Thank you, Rabbi Samuels, both for the introduction and for welcoming me to your shul and Kehillah and your pulpit, and thank you to Mattia for the introduction. It's funny, I have a complex getting up here in Boston with a very erudite rabbi and a very academically well-read community to come talk about 2 topics for which I neither have the academic background nor perhaps the erudition, but I will do my best to try to attack both the Torah, particularly this week's Parsha, and perhaps some of the former old-time economic zeitgeist and the current economic zeitgeist and see if we can bring them together here. And then what I hope to finish with is just 5 to 7 minutes. I should take out a timer because I have a tendency to go on too long. And I hope to attack some of what's going on in Israel right now from an economic perspective. So many of you are probably now familiar with the term transitory. Transitory is a word that has entered our economic lexicon in the last 12 months, particularly to describe inflation. And there's a big discussion among economists and bankers as to whether the inflation that is being talked about in the US economy, the global economy today, is what is called transitory, or is this permanent or even hyperinflation right now? And this has become a giant debate, primarily on Twitter, but also in the storied halls of national banks around the world. And of course, inflation is a serious topic, right? We've had pretty stable inflation for the last decade or so, despite the money printing that happened after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. But certainly some of the indicators indicate that inflation is on the rise. And what I want to talk about today is this notion, not in the context of inflation, because they didn't know what inflation was back in the time of the Torah, but this notion of transitory and permanent and how we react differently, right? For if you believe inflation is transitory, you will have one type of reaction, both as an individual investor, consumer, economist, bank leader. If you believe it's permanent, you'll have a different reaction and you'll choose different policy initiatives and make different investments depending on your view. And the same is true of economic life, and I will argue Jewish, perhaps spiritual life. And I want to use that framework to look at the psukim at the beginning of this week's parasha. The story begins with Yaakov coming back to the land of Canaan, to the land of Israel, and encountering Esav. And he sends some messengers with a large number of animals. Now, I won't go into the exact numbers of the animals, but it's a large herd. In fact, a very, very large herd. There's been a fair amount of research about old shepherds, and how big a flock that they can contain. Take me at my word when I tell you this is a large herd that Yaakov sends to Esav. What should be strange about this to us is Yaakov just recently picked up this extraordinary wealth and herds in the house of Lavan. At the end of his time in Haran, we all know the story where Yaakov was accused by Lavan of trickery. Maybe he had better breeding habits. Maybe he knew something about the biology of herds. In one way or another, he managed to manipulate the herds to become exactly the speckled and spotted and brown ksavim that he wanted and had agreed with Lavan that he would take. So he acquires this herd wealth in Haran, promptly goes back to Eretz Yisrael at the beckoning of Hashem, and encounters Esav. And what does he promptly do? Separates from his herds. He sends them over as a mincha, as an offering, a peace offering, if you will, to Esav. The next story, Yaakov, of course, successfully navigates that. And the next story is the story of Dinah. Yaakov's daughter goes off. We all know the story, and is abducted, perhaps raped, by the leader of Shechem. There's a conversation between Yaakov and the leaders of Shechem, and then Shimon and Levi do what they do. They wipe out, certainly, the majority of the population of Shechem. In between these two stories is a critical little story that is glossed over, but it's critical in our understanding of Yaakov, first and foremost, and of what's going on here at this junction, at this transition between Haran and Eretz Canaan. Here's the little story. Esav leaves to Seir. V'Yaakov nasa Sukkota, va'ivin lo bayit u'lemikneu asa Sukkot, al ken kara Hashem hamakom Sukkot. Yaakov goes to this place called Sukkot. We don't know what it is. He builds a house, limikneu, what's left of his flocks. He builds these Sukkot, these dwellings, and that's why the place is called Sukkot. And we understand that Yaakov is left with a flock. He still has herds, smaller clearly, and he settles in his place. Now, wait a minute. Yaakov was told by Hashem, leave Haran and go back to Eretz Yisrael. Has he made it? We know where Sukkot is, the Yerushalmi and others, but the geography is pretty clear, is on the other side of the Jordan River, on the eastern bank, if you will, of the Jordan River. That's where Sukkot is. And they're grazing lands. So Yaakov stops on his way back to Eretz Yisrael. He pauses his trip and stays put, not following what Hashem told him. He stops. God didn't say stop in Sukkot. He said, go back. And why is he stopping? So that's question number one. The second, if we move 2 more psukim ahead, we discover the following. The next pasuk starts by Yavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. And everyone knows that there's 2 or 3 perushim of what the word Shalem means. Either he comes in peace, or he comes Shalem b'mamono, Shalem b'gufo, full in his money and full in his body. Ir Shechem asher be'eretz Canaan b'vo mipadan aram vayichan et pnei ha'ir. He finally comes back. He gets into Eretz Canaan. He stops right in front of the town of Shechem. And what does he do? Vayiken et chalkat hasadeh asher nata sham ohalo miyad b'nei chamor avi Shechem. First thing Yaakov does when he gets to Eretz Canaan is he buys a piece of land. Vayiken et chalkat hasadeh. He buys this piece of land where he pitched his tent from the locals, from chamor avi Shechem. The Torah tells us the price. B'me'ak sita. There's a price tag attached to this piece of land, but not just a price tag, the type of instrument that was used to convey the value, ksita. Now, ksita is a really interesting word. Many of the Mefarshim explained it as a type of money, but we actually know what the word money means because the last time we had a price tag on something is when Avram bought Marat HaMachpelah. And it says, Arba me'ot shekel kesef over la socher, 400 shekels that are made out of silver. And silver is a normative form of money, at least at the time. But ksita, which most of the Mefarshim say is money, I think in fact is something else. Unkelos, in a different place, translates ksita as animals, as herds. He gives 100 animals in exchange for this field. And now we begin to have an interesting story. Because if Yaakov sends his flock to Esav that he had just taken from Lavan, he then stops in Sukkot, and the Torah tells us, Ulimikneu asa Sukkot, and for his herds and flocks, he built dwellings, and now he takes these same flocks and herds and pays them to Chamor, Avi Shechem, the ruler of Shechem, in order to buy a piece of land. We've got kind of one contiguous story going on here, and that's what I want to unpack. So in order to unpack the story, I need to back up a tad. And we need to back up to the story of Yitzchak. If I say, who is Yitzchak? Everyone says Yitzchak. He was part of Akedat Yitzchak. Avram tried to shecht him on the altar. Who else was Yitzchak? Well, he had twin sons, and he was blind, and he was fooled by his son Yaakov, who took the brachot from Esav, and that's kind of the story you know about Yitzchak. There's another important story about Yitzchak, though, and that is when he goes during the time of economic depression. There's a famine at the beginning of last week's parasha, Parashat Toldot. There is the second famine. The first famine, of course, happened in the time of Abraham. The second famine then happens in the time of Yitzchak. And God says to him, stop. You can't go down to Egypt like your father did. That won't work for you. And instinctively, we all know, because it's what we grew up on, that Yitzchak couldn't go because he was what's called in Chazal an olat tmima. He was the sacrifice on the altar. He was holy. He could not leave the land of Israel, perhaps. But I think in addition to that, Yitzchak's destiny was to settle the land of Israel. Yes, he may have been an olat tmima. He may have been holy in a different way than Avram was, and maybe than Yaakov was. But more importantly, his job, whereas his father, his transient wealth into permanent assets, farmland. That's what he does on entering the land. This then leaves us
with another question. If this is kind of the course of the historic move of the Avot of the forefathers, where Avraham comes and he brings his rechush, right? That's what the Torah tells us. That he brings the rechush and the nefesh sha'asu b'charan.
I apologize. For about 2 minutes, the sound went out. Can you just summarize what you said in the past?
Sure.
People can hear me.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to summarize what I said in the last 2 minutes at the request of Rabbi Samuels. So what we now have, so just to try to summarize what I think was the last 2 minutes, we now have a theme. And the theme is that there is transitory wealth represented by herds, flocks, and permanent wealth and establishment, which is represented by fields. Yitzchak, who is ordered to stay in the land of Israel, plants when he's physically safe among the Plishtim. And as I mentioned, this was a story of also the first and second Aliyah that became engaged in agriculture. And now, Yaakov, when he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, during his time in Haran, he spent time aggregating herds. That's what he did for Lavan, and that's what he left with. His first act on re-entering Eretz Yisrael, his first act is to transfer this flock wealth, his cattle, me'ak sita, 100 goats, for a piece of land where he pitched his tent outside of Shechem. And so we have an emerging story here where Avraham comes from Aram Naharaim. He brings the nefesh, his rechush, from there. And by the way, it's gold and silver and flocks. It's movable. It's transient. Then comes Yitzchak, who's Yehud. His purpose is to establish residence in the land. And Yitzchak builds an agricultural empire with many slaves, as was the case back then, and with much success. Yaakov, who was forced to run away, sent away, it's not our topic for today, goes to Haran, to the house of Lavan, and his whole time there he is engaged with flocks to tell you, I'm not staying. This is not my home. What does he do when he comes back to Eretz Yisrael, to Eretz Canaan? His first act, he takes me'ak sita, 100 he-goats, 100 flocks, and converts them to the land outside of Shechem. Now, in this discussion, I skipped over what I called the super important pasuk before. And that's this pasuk. V'Yaakov nasa Sukkota, va'ibn lo bayit u'mikneu asa Sukkot, akein kara Shem makom Sukkot. Yaakov traveled to Sukkot. Remember we said, Hashem told him, go back to Eretz Canaan. He said, go back. He didn't. He waited. Chazal and Farshim say it was 18 months that he waited. He didn't go back. He stayed in the Ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan, Transjordan. He builds a house. He builds Sukkot for his flocks, and therefore the place is called Sukkot. Now, from the Jerusalem Talmud, but I think it's obvious, we know that Sukkot, it appears in the Sefer Yoshua as well, is a place that is rich in pasture lands. It also appears in the request of the Bnei Gad, the Bnei Ruvain. They want to stay in the Ever HaYarden. Why? Alav adecha mikneh. We have a lot of cattle. We want them to stay here and graze, and we'll build cities. So they stayed on that side of the Jordan. It is rich pasture land. Why did Yaakov, who left his father and mother, hasn't seen them in 20 plus years, just had an encounter with his estranged brother that turned out okay, how come he didn't run home? God said, go home. Why didn't he run home? The first time I paid attention to this, it was like startling to me. I understand, we just had a 2-year pandemic. The hardest thing about a 2-year pandemic, I didn't see my sister who lives in Los Angeles. She hadn't seen my parents. What's the first thing you do when the sky's open? You go see your family. Now, I realize times were different back then, but still, he's going back. God told him, go back. Go see your parents. What are you doing? And this bothered me. This question bothered me for a long time. I want to suggest an answer that is, I think, important. Yaakov understands from the battle with Esav, what happens in the battle there? He gets a name change. He becomes Israel. He is going to be the father of what we now call the Jewish people, Bnei Israel. This is no longer, a battle with his father-in-law, a battle with his brother. This is about what does the future of our people look like? And in the rear view mirror, Yaakov says, before I came back to come establish this people, I had a questionable business dealing with my father-in-law. What did the sons of Lavan say? He developed his wealth because he stole. Because he stole from our father-in-law. Because he biologically engineered the sheep, the flocks to come out spotted and speckled so he could walk off with all of Lavan's wealth. Yes, Chazal explained how he was entitled to it. Yes, even I can believe he was entitled to it and he was ripped off by his father-in-law. But still, whether it was through ingenious breeding techniques, biological engineering, I don't know what, somehow that wealth, that empire, that herding empire, that shepherding empire that he built was kind of not kosher. It wasn't fully okay. So what does Yaakov do? He comes back, he confronts his brother Esav, and what does he send him? The money he picked up, the wealth, the flocks that he picked up in the house of Lavan. And he ships off a large portion of it. I don't want that. And then what does he do? He says, if I'm going to restart my empire on the ethics and principles of my grandfather and my father, if I'm going to build a nation in the land of Israel that is built on timeless principles, on the integrity of Abraham and Yitzchak, I need to restart my business. He stops in Sukkot. He's not going to buy real estate there or land there or plant a farm there because he's not staying. But he is going to do a restart. He stays in the pasture land and he rebuilds his shepherding business on good principles. Not what he took from Lavan. This is a rebuild, a restart that he did himself, that he did with his family. He built a home, even a bayit. And he restarts. And he restarts so that he can take this money in good conscience and timeless principles, walk into the land of Israel and trade this very kosher wealth for a permanent establishment, for a piece of land that he buys outside of Shechem. And so Yaakov Avinu, our forefather Yaakov, establishes a model to aspire to. Number one, we go through exiles for various reasons. Sometimes it's anti-Semitism, who was chased out by his brother Esav. Sometimes because we need to find a wife, which is one of the reasons the Shulchan Aruch says you can leave Eretz Yisrael to find a wife. But if we want to establish something that's lasting, a homeland for a people, but not just a homeland, a foundation for a people, it must be established on the right values. It can't be suspect, like what the sons of Lavan said to him when he left Lavan's house. It must be clean. And so he comes to Shechem and he buys this piece of land. He says, I'm here. And not just that. Shechem ben Hamor, or Hamor, Avi Shechem, is the ruler of the Chivi, of the biggest people. He is in charge of this very critical region, by the way. We don't go to Shechem that much anymore. We don't realize just how critical it was in ancient times. But like the trade route passed right through there. It's on what's called the Gavahar, the mountaintop that goes all the way from Hebron to Shechem. It's a critical place. Not by accident does the Torah tell us in Sefer Dvarim that you need to go to Har Gerizim and Har Eival, which is right around Shechem. This is a place not by accident Is this the place that Yosef travels to later in the book of Bereshit? Not by accident. Is this the place that Yoravam, right? After when he splits the kingdoms of Israel and Judea, that's where it's established. This is a fundamental place in ancient Canaan, in ancient Eretz Israel. This is a core place, and Yaakov goes there first. And he makes a deal with Hamor Avi Shechem. Hamor, the father of Shechem, was the ruler. And he does good business with him. And he's trying to go establish good neighborly relations. So he does something together. He enters into a transaction. I have a theory, which is in the third book of the series, not yet translated into English, on Vayikra. And in the introduction there, I attempt to explain why it is that most people's conception of how people become close is confused. We say, if I'm close to you, then I'll do business with you. It's in fact exactly the opposite. By working together, sweating together, doing together, we become closer. That's how you develop relationships, because you go through ups and downs and you sweat together and do things together. And that's what Yaakov is saying here, which is, I'll do business with Shechem ben Hamor, with Hamor Avi Shechem, and we'll have good relations. It goes sour. Why does it go sour? Because his son breaks the implicit trust. Because Yaakov, the two fathers understood what it took to build a relationship so you could cohabitate the land. But pay attention. The son, Hamor, was entitled. He's the son of the king. He takes whatever he wants. And he took the daughter of Yaakov. Shimon and Levi, the brothers, their upbringing was in the house of Lavan. They were used to cheating. That's what they saw around. That's the home that they were brought up in. That was grandpa. They didn't have the benefit that Yaakov did to see Abraham, to see Yitzchak. They just came back, they got to Shechem, they haven't even seen the parents and grandparents. Grandfather Abraham was gone. They didn't have access to those timeless principles. Yaakov attempted to reestablish them, but they were ripped out from under him by his children who did not have that same upbringing, that didn't get it in the house of Lavan, in Haran, in a place where everything was transient and nobody was trusted. And so Yaakov, on entering the land, teaches us a critically important principle, or a few critically important principles. Number one, times change. As I said before, Abraham started with one kind of business. He was in the flocks and the gold and the silver business. Yitzchak built an agricultural empire. Yaakov had to transition between them depending on time and place, indicating that if I was in the Golah, if I was in Galut, if I was in the diaspora, I've got one kind of wealth. If I come to Eretz Yisrael, I need a different kind of business, one that stays permanent. Change is the only constant. That's not my own. That's the only thing we can be served is there's change. The second thing I think Yaakov teaches us in this story is that as you adapt to this change, as you adapt to the difficult circumstances, you need to keep your principles front and center. I have to believe that when Yaakov decides to wait 18 months on the precipice of entering Eretz Canaan and seeing his father and his mother, he must have thought really hard about that. But he decided that as the father of a nation, if he didn't show his kids certain principles of the kind of economy we want to build in the land of Israel, the kind of economy our nation needs for the long term, if he didn't do it, then it would be lost. The proof that it almost didn't work, or basically didn't work, is the kids cheated Hamor and Shechem. They still had the values of Lavan. And so it didn't last. It's a tragedy. Yaakov tried so hard. He knew he was Yisrael. If you want to build Am Yisrael, it needs to be built on principles. But it didn't work out. I think that's the second lesson. In a hard decision to spend 18 months in the Evar Yarden, in a really hard decision to spend 18 months in the Evar Yarden, Yaakov taught us a lesson. And I think the third piece, after everything changes, the only constant is change, and the need for fundamental principles is that when you get back, I'll say it differently. If you are in the Golah for a period, for whatever period you're there, it needs to be transient, transitory, a way station. We established permanent residence by buying land and farming in Israel, in the land of Israel. That's Yaakov's teaching. We strive for permanence in the land that Hashem promised us. It is an aspiration, even if you can't fulfill it at a given moment in time, that defiant aspiration and defiant behavior to buy land, to establish a permanent residence, is preserved for Eretz Yisrael. That is an aspiration that Yaakov Avinu teaches us, in which, tragically, he only fulfills for a short period of time. It's deeply tragic. He spends all this time in Lavan's house. He comes back, he buys a piece of land, and some years later, in another family, he finds himself down in Egypt, and his son had been down there. But he always keeps that aspiration front and center, and he acts on it when he comes back. And I think that's very critical. And with that, I want to transition for a few minutes, as promised, to the modern state. I don't think I'm telling anyone anything new when I say that these are interesting times. And that it feels like there's a lot in transition. In my day job as a venture capitalist, I invest in technology, I invest in change. And I'm certain it's happening. Very, very certain it's happening. And I'm certain it's accelerating too. At the same time, the economy is going through perturbations in many different ways. And people are looking for what to grasp onto. And number one, we're very fortunate. And the reason that we're very fortunate is, unlike tweets, which seem to be able to disappear in a matter of seconds, this has held the test of 3,000 years of time, plus thousands of years of time. And the values of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have lasted thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So we have an anchor to look back at. In swirling winds and chaos, we all look for something to grab onto, and we've been blessed. I often joke that the Torah has more unique users than Google and Facebook combined, certainly over the course of history. It's not an accident. It matters, and it's translatable into any generation. The second thing is, in this moment in time, where in some places, to use modern economic terms, socialism is making a comeback, capitalism is having its issues, global economies are gyrating. I think the question we need to ask ourselves, and I'll say it a little differently, 73 years into the state of Israel, the question it needs to ask ourselves is, what is the difference? What is unique about an Israeli economy, a Jewish economy? In 1948, when Ben-Gurion established the state, he did exactly the right thing, which he talked about the ingathering exiles, providing a safe place for the Jewish people to live and flourish. 73 years in, we need to ask, what can we create that is uniquely Israeli, uniquely Jewish Israeli? Israeli has this tendency to think about citizenship. When I say Israeli, I mean B'nai Israel writ large. We have an opportunity for the first time in 2,000 years to create something unique based on timeless principles of Torah and modern principles of economics and technology. And Israel is one of the 4 or 5 places in the world where you have deep engines of innovation, right? It's the United States, it's Israel, even the US, by the way, it's Boston, San Francisco, and New York, roughly. Miami making a comeback or making a claim. But the United States, Israel, Shanghai, maybe Cambridge in the UK, not many places. But we have a unique opportunity to ask ourselves, if Yaakov was around today, what would he say would be the uniquely B'nai Israeli economy that we can give to the world in the sense of being a light unto the nations? What is a uniquely Israeli civic square? What is infused by Jewish values on a national level and not just on a communal level? And this is an opportunity that's been given to us. And it's not one that comes back. Finished surviving the Holocaust, the Six-Day War, the 1973 war, and I'm not saying all the security problems are gone. But what is the dream and what is the vision that draws from the deep anchors and the deep sources of the past that we can drive for our children and grandchildren, that we can implement? And how is that economy? How is that civic square? How is that governance different than anything that's been around in the world? And it's an opportunity we should not take lightly. This technology engine that I have the unbelievable fortune and bracha of being able to work with every day, in Tel Aviv, I tell you, looks different than it does in Silicon Valley in a meaningful way. I can't speak that much for Boston. When I meet entrepreneurs every day, and Matya mentioned Scale Up Nation before, in this Dan Senor and Saul Singer, who wrote the book Startup Nation, are like heroes of mine. They branded a country. It's like remarkable. And in this country, now referred to as Startup Nation, when I see entrepreneurs walk in, they talk about the principles before they talk about the total addressable market, the dollars. We can save, today it's going to go live, we can save lives of people dying of kidney disorder by turning a smartphone into a urine testing clinic, literally. And Yonatan Adiri, who started that company, walked into my office and he said, hey, look, I'm sure there's a big business here, but we can save a lot of lives like this and get people in disadvantaged communities access to urine diagnosis on their smartphone. And that'll prevent most of CKD, chronic kidney disorder. And when Ron Shear from Nexar walks in, he says, yeah, I got a better dash cam model, but we can save lives on the roads if we can predict and see potential car crashes way before they happen and create a network so people don't have to spend $100,000 on a Tesla. And so in Tel Aviv, in the context of Kimitzion Tetzei Torah, in this case, Tel Aviv, we're starting to see over the last 5 or 6 years this unique Israeli principles-based technology economy come to the fore. And I find it inspiring. And so when we think about our role, what do we take out of this parsha coming up upon us? It's much more than Yaakov got by Esau. It's much more than Dinah and Shimon and Levi. It's this lesson of Yaakov, of what are the values that we want to build B'nai Yisrael on for the next 73 years of the state of Israel, for the future of our people. And that takes a big joint effort. One where everybody, as they like to say in Hebrew, puts their shoulder under the stretcher. Where everybody is driving the bus in roughly the same direction. Yes, with arguments, every Beit Midrash has an argument, but is driving the bus in the right direction. And I think as we approach the third decade of the 21st century, the challenges are right here, but so are the opportunities. And we have opportunities that our grandparents could have only dreamed about, whether it's technologically and Jewishly. Opportunities our grandparents could have only dreamed about. And it sits on us to take the lessons of the forefathers of Yaakov and to bring it to what truly should become a promised land.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael. Does anyone have a question or a comment or a response? Please, Michael Rubin.
And so it's great to hear that you're exposed to fundamental values bring to the table. But the facts are, generally speaking, to date, that the general model within the entrepreneurial community in Israel has been to sell companies. You start them, you build to a certain extent, and you sell them over and over again, which Israel has become terrific at doing, and has generally speaking been the mode of operation within the groups of people who were starting companies. So do you think that?
Yeah, I think that used to be true. It's not true really now. Meaning that used to be true.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, it's nice that I was saying that you have the chance to build these big companies, et cetera, but the model of Israeli entrepreneurship has been to sell the companies. That's the problem with the book Startup Nation, is that like froze it in history. And when it was written, it was true that Israel was this innovation engine and it sold companies. But if you look at the last 8 years, and what's funny is when we raised our first fund at Aleph, we went out and said things were changing and that people wanted to build large companies out of Israel. And that's exactly what's happened, by the way, whether it's Wix or JFrog or Solar Edge or Lemonade or Melio, and I can go on. But the aspiration of the Israeli entrepreneurs over the last, called 8 to 9 years, has been build them big and keep them in Israel and keep headquarters in Israel. And the internet has enabled that. And by the way, the pandemic has enabled that more. So and that notion, they need to rewrite the book. As much as they branded the country, they need to rewrite the book for 2021.
Please.
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Repeat it, please.
Okay, I was asked, has Shmitta impacted the high-tech world of the economy, and how might it? So in the third volume, the one on Vayikra, I have a whole chapter on this topic, or most of a chapter. Right, so Shmitta heretofore has been thought of as an agricultural phenomenon. What do we do about the food? And this is every 7 years. This is my 5th Shmitta in Israel. My first year there was Shmitta. This was called Yavul Nachri. They bring fruits and veggies from outside of Israel. It's going to be Heter Michra, they sell the land and take it, or it's now become more popular, Otsar Beit Din, because it keeps the Kedushat Shvit. And without detracting one iota from that argument that's been going back to the time of Rav Kook, I think there's a more important topic we need to talk about. And here's where the technology people are actually working. And that is Shmitat Ksafim, this very forgotten notion that alongside letting the land lay fallow, there's debt forgiveness during Shmitat Ksafim. And if you excuse me for a 3-minute halachic digression, I will try to walk through the halachic issues at hand. So, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, who edited or composed or put together the Mishnayot, fundamentally did away with the biblical notion of Shmita, of the 7th sabbatical year. It was incredibly elegant. He wanted to, if you read the Gemara carefully, particularly the Jerusalem Talmud, you'll see that he wanted to do away with Shmita altogether. There was opposition for Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, and it didn't work out that way. So instead, there was an innovative drasha, right? How you explain the psukim, in which Shmita is tied to Yovel. If there's no Yovel, the 50th Jubilee year, there is no Shmita. And the 50th Jubilee year is contingent on not just most of Am Yisrael being back in Israel, but it has to be seated or placed or in place in each of its places. So if you don't have the 12 tribes back in their land, you don't have Yovel. If you don't have Yovel, you don't have Shmita from the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi understood very well that since Sancheriv came and chased away 10 tribes, there was no way that we were ever going back to this. We just don't confront this in kind of a straight manner, which is ingeniously, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi did away with Shmita on the Doraisa level, on the Torah level, forever. That's what he did. It's gone. Now, the Gemara spends some time attaching Shmitat Ksafim, loan forgiveness, to the Shmita of the land, which is how it got
mixed together. And the reason they did that is to unleash the credit markets. What happened? The Gemara tells us that exactly what the Torah warned, right? That you say, Karva Shnata Sheva Shnata Shmita, V'ra'incha B'achicha Evyon, and you won't give them a loan, right? You see the 7th year is coming, and you won't give the poor farmer who needs to buy seeds and a plow and whatever in order to plant his land, you won't give them a loan because it's going to be wiped out in the 7th year. So the credit markets literally froze up. And comes Hillel Azaken and says, we have an economic problem here. There's a great financial crisis. Nobody is lending money anymore. The credit markets froze up in front of the Shmitta year. What do? We call it a pruzbul. Now everybody, by routine, as the end of Shmitta comes, they write a pruzbul. You walk into shul, the rabbi hands you a piece of paper, you sign it, you have no idea what's written there. But what you did was you handed your debts over to Beit Din so that they can collect it. And this is a workaround for how your debts, your loans are not wiped out by Shmitta. And so we continue to keep people indebted because of this. And with full deference to Hillel Zaken, I am 100% certain that the credit markets froze up in his time and there was need to do this. But this is a workaround. And by the way, it's a workaround. I'll never forget this. 14 years ago, I know exactly when it was. I was in a shul in Herzliya. It came the end of Shmita. A rabbi from Bnei Brak walked in the door. He passed out papers that said on Pruzbul. Nobody read it. They all signed it. And he said, good, now your debts are. Who has debts? Nobody asked. Who had loans out that they can collect? Nobody asked. How does it work? Nobody asked. Does it apply to me necessarily? Because it doesn't apply to all kinds of loans. No, nobody asked. Sign the paper, you're good to go. This drives me batty, if you can't tell. But now, it's post-COVID. We got a lot of people having a hard time getting back on their feet. A lot of people. And we've taken out loans. And I think this is a golden opportunity for where technology, which is spending a lot of time in the loan space, in the personal finance space, all sorts of AI algorithms, where we can make a dent, where we can maybe look at Shmitat Ksafim and say, wait a minute, we can put technology to amazing use to try to see how we have a different answer to Shmitat Ksafim than the Pruzbul. And I'm actually working on something like this right now. This is a big passion project of mine. How to bring Shmitat Ksafim back to relevance, I think, candidly, is more important right now than the agricultural one. There's no way to feed everybody in Israel or keep these farmers in business for forever. If we don't rely on the Heter Mechira, there's some workarounds for small populations, but for the general population, it's not possible. I'm not sure what the technology solution is other than robots. And we have other issues with that because it's the land and not just the workers. So, but I think in Shmitat Ksafim, there's actually a lot of work that we can do there. And I hope we'll start getting to it. If we don't finish it this one by the end of Shmita, hopefully by the next one. Sorry for the long digression.
No, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. We'll take one last question. I also just want to say before we hear, I think your cousin, Mr. Vizhniak, share. Please.
Cousin to Michael, and I was actually curious if you could expand a little bit more about what you were talking about earlier with Israel as a technology hub compared to Silicon Valley or other technology hubs, and just talk a little bit about what makes it unique. And is it the people, the geography, the history? Maybe you can expand upon that.
Yeah, good question. I often tell a funny story. So,
Just repeat the question.
oh, sorry. The question is, I could expand on Israel as a technology hub. What makes it unique? I often give the following brief economic history of Israel. So, sometime in the 50s, I'm not exactly sure where, apparently the UN sent a commission that said that the amount of water between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean could only feed like 600,000 people. I'll just point out that there's like 12 or 13 million people between the Jordan and the Mediterranean today, maybe 14 million at this point. That's also a comment on the UN, but we'll leave that for another time. What does Israel economy promptly do? We export orange water. Right? What's oranges? When you export oranges, the Jaffa orange, it's water. I mean, it's just, most of our fruit is water. And so, well, what does that tell you? It tells you that Israel is really good as a country of making a lot out of a little. And you can kind of see this throughout time. I'll spare you like the whole history, but I'll just give you two quick examples. Drip irrigation. What is drip irrigation? Take a little bit of water and make a lot out of it. Voice over IP, you may remember, knows the first company in voice over IP was a company called Vocal Tech in Israel. What's voice over IP? It's how I squeeze voice
down an IP data line. It's taking what at the time was a very narrow band connection and putting voice on it. And I can go on. Some of the two earliest video players on the internet. One was a company called VDO based in Israel and Boston, by the way, and the other one was Real Audio and Real Video, started by Rob Glazer out in Seattle. And so this is what the Israeli economy, I think, is particularly good at and defines in many ways Israeli innovation in many areas. It's taking a lot and squeezing it through a little or making a lot out of a little. I mentioned Nexar before. They took a standard phone and a standard dash cam, and with software and $50-$60, they created what other people are paying $1,000 or $50,000 for the Tesla cameras for. And it's just very common in this ecosystem where the urine device I told you before replaces a $200,000 piece of lab equipment with a smartphone. And so that's kind of point one. Point two, I did a panel in Tel Aviv with a woman named Tamara Cohen Harel, who was one of the founders of a company called Rise Up. It was not Orthodox or religious. And some guy from the audience raised his hand and said, hey, you seem to be talking about similar principles, but you grew up with a Torah background and she didn't. How does that work? And Tamara's mother is Israeli and father is Egyptian born and then British. I paused for a second and noticed something I hadn't noticed for a while. Ben Gurion, in addition to being a genius statesman, was a genius in anthropology. By returning the Hebrew language to use, he and Ben Yehuda, etc., he brought the Bible, the Tanakh, back into modern parlance. And because the language we speak actually informs our values, there's a lot of philosophy about this, informs our values, by making Hebrew the spoken tongue of Israel, you have infused the economic actors, the political actors, every actor with 3,000 and 4,000-year-old values, because that's where the language comes from. And I hadn't thought about that until that moment. And I think, to your point, the language spoken by the entrepreneurs is Hebrew. Yes, you can get away with English in Israel in the tech scene. It's not a problem. But because they come with a Hebrew bias, I think they are bringing to bear the values from here into their innovation and into the work that they do. And I think that is a big differentiator as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to once again thank our co-sponsors, the Adam Street Synagogue and Beit Sasson. I want to acknowledge Harav Durrani, and I have to tell you, Harav Durrani is one of our teachers in the community, in addition to being the rabbi at Beit Sasson. He teaches at my Mani school. He's my own children's teacher. And he, like you, always asks this question: what lesson can we learn from Medinat Yisrael and from Am Yisrael from the Torah? And so to hear you bring that and then layers with your experience is just another wonderful model of a Torah Chaim, a living Torah. We have for every family participant here, Michael Eisenberg's book. We're going to have a book signing in the tent. We also have refreshments, coffee, tea, and some nash. If you'd like to make a donation, $15 was the discounted price the shul was able to access it for. But that's a donation. We'll have a copy for each, like I said, participant family. To the shul. Yeah, to the shul. Not to me. Not to Michael. No, but everyone gets a book, and they'll be available in the tent, and Michael will be available at the tent, and we could have some refreshments and say hello, and he'll sign the books. So thank you for joining. Thank you, everyone online. We really apologize about the technical difficulties. We're glad you stuck to it. Thank you.